Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping back into one of history's most fascinating civilizations, ancient Rome. But not the Rome of emperors and legions and grand speeches in the Senate. Tonight we're looking at the Rome that would make a modern person deeply uncomfortable within about 5 minutes of arriving. The Rome where perfectly sensible, intelligent, cultured people did things every single day that would get you arrested, hospitalized, or at least very firmly asked to leave in the modern world. We're talking about the perfectly normal things that feel totally wrong in ancient Rome, and there are a lot of them. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let us begin where everyone eventually has to begin, which is with the Romans and their approach to personal hygiene and bathroom habits. Because nothing quite prepares a modern visitor for the Roman relationship with their bodily functions. The Romans were not, by ancient standards, a dirty people. They were actually remarkable for their attention to personal cleanliness, the public baths, the aqueducts, the sophisticated drainage systems of their cities, and yet their specific approach to certain bathroom activities would strike the modern visitor as so spectacularly communal, so cheerfully public, so entirely devoid of the privacy that modern sensibility considers an absolute minimum requirement, that it is worth spending some time with. The public toilet, the Forica, is one of the most characteristic institutions of Roman urban life, and it is nothing like a modern public restroom. It is a room, typically with stone benches running along the walls, in which holes have been cut at regular intervals, usually about 60 centimeters apart. There are no partitions between the holes. There are no doors. The users of the Forica sit side by side in close proximity, conducting their business in full view of each other, often while conducting conversations, conducting business negotiations, or simply watching the street outside. The Forica is a social space. Romans of all classes use it, from the wealthy merchant to the street vendor, and the proximity enforced by the bench seating is considered entirely normal. The sponge on a stick deserves its own paragraph. In the absence of toilet paper, which is a very modern invention, Romans clean themselves with a sponge attached to the end of a stick, and this sponge is shared among all the users of the toilet. It lives in a container of salt water or vinegar between uses, which provides some degree of sanitation, though not quite the degree that a modern person would find reassuring. The sponge is passed from user to user without particular ceremony, in the same way that a modern person might pass someone the paper towels. The Latin word for this implement, the xylospongium, is one of those words that, once you know what it refers to, you cannot quite unknow. Our three companions tonight are Marcus, a Roman citizen of the middle class, a merchant who deals in olive oil and dried fish and who lives in a comfortable insula apartment in the Subura district of Rome in the 1st century CE. There is Livia, a freed woman who runs a small thermopolium, a street food establishment, near the Forum, whose business puts her at the heart of the city's daily commercial and social life. And there is Gaius, a medical student from a Greek family in Rome who is training under a physician near the Tiber and who brings to everything he encounters the particular combination of curiosity and systematic observation that his training demands. All three of them use the Forica without a second thought. All three of them would be baffled by the modern person's reaction to it. The Roman relationship with urine is equally, shall we say, pragmatic. Urine was collected from the public latrines, and from the large clay pots called dolia that were placed on street corners specifically for this purpose, and sold to the fullers who used it to clean and treat woolen cloth. The ammonia in urine is genuinely effective for this purpose, which is why the practice persisted. The fullers' establishments were a feature of every Roman neighborhood, their workers treading cloth in vats of collected urine while passers-by noted the smell and thought nothing of it. The Emperor Vespasian famously imposed a tax on the urine collectors, and when his son Titus objected that the tax was undignified, Vespasian held a coin under his son's nose and said, "Does it smell?" The money, he meant, did not carry the smell of its origin. This is where the phrase pecunia non olet, money has no smell, comes from. Marcus uses the fullery near his apartment to have his toga cleaned. He hands it over without particular reflection on what the cleaning process involves, picks it up 3 days later clean and pressed, and wears it to conduct business at the forum. The toga is a complicated and expensive garment. Several meters of wool in a specific draped arrangement that requires considerable skill to put on correctly, and keeping it clean and properly white is both a practical necessity and a social statement. A stained or grayish toga marks the wearer as someone who cannot afford proper laundering, which is a social disadvantage in a society where appearance communicates status with considerable precision. Marcus's toga is always white. He prefers not to think about why. Roman dental hygiene is another area where the gap between Roman normalcy and modern comfort is significant. Romans clean their teeth, which is more than can be said for many subsequent medieval populations, but what they clean them with is a subject that requires a certain amount of equanimity to approach. The Romans used tooth powder, which is so far so reasonable, but the tooth powder of choice in much of the Roman world is made from finely ground pumice stone mixed with, among other things, charcoal, burnt eggshell, powdered oyster shell, and urine. Specifically, the urine of Portuguese people, which was considered particularly potent for dental purposes and was imported to Rome for this use. The ammonia in urine does have genuine whitening and antimicrobial properties, which is why the practice was not simply superstition. It was applied chemistry, just applied in a way that no modern toothpaste manufacturer would put on their packaging. Roman medicine is a fascinating combination of genuine scientific insight and practices that range from the merely ineffective to the actively alarming. The Romans inherit the Greek medical tradition, Hippocrates, Galen, which is the most scientifically sophisticated in the ancient world, and they extend and develop it. The Roman army's medical corps is remarkably sophisticated by ancient standards, with dedicated field hospitals, surgical instruments that would not look entirely out of place in a 19th century operating theater, and a detailed understanding of wound treatment that comes from the grim practical experience of managing the casualties of military campaigns across several continents. Gaius watches the physician he trains under perform a cataract operation, which involves inserting a needle into the eye and using it to push the clouded lens out of the line of sight, a procedure called couching that is, in skilled hands, genuinely effective at restoring some degree of vision. The patient is conscious throughout, held still by assistants, given something for the pain, wine or a decoction of poppy, but conscious, their eye open, the needle going in. Gaius has seen this done 4 times now, and he still has to concentrate on maintaining the detached professional observation that his training requires and that the procedure's visual character makes somewhat difficult to sustain. The Roman pharmacopoeia includes genuine medicinal plants that are still used in medicine today: willow bark, which contains the precursor of aspirin; poppy, which contains opium; digitalis, which we still use for heart conditions, alongside treatments that are considerably less evidence-based. Crocodile dung is recommended for skin conditions. The ashes of a wolf's liver, taken in wine, are prescribed for certain internal complaints. The dried and powdered liver of a gladiator, taken fresh from the wound, is recommended as a treatment for epilepsy, the theory being that the gladiator's strength and courage would transfer to the epileptic patient. Gaius notes all of these in his treatment records with the same careful handwriting he uses for the treatments that actually work, because in the 1st century CE the distinction between the two categories is not as clear as it will later become. Blood is a recurring feature of Roman medicine that would make the modern emergency room physician somewhat uncomfortable. Gladiatorial blood, collected at the arena and sold immediately after the fight, is prescribed as a treatment for epilepsy so consistently that vendors at the Colosseum make a specific business of it. The blood of a dying gladiator was considered particularly potent, which meant that people with epilepsy would sometimes be brought to ringside at gladiatorial combats to receive the blood as close to its source as possible. This practice persists into late antiquity and represents a strand of Roman medical thinking that is neither entirely rational nor entirely irrational. Gladiators were genuinely extremely physically fit people, and the idea that their vitality might be transferable has a certain internal logic, even if the mechanism is completely wrong. The Roman dinner party, the cena, is one of the most elaborate social institutions of the ancient world, and it is one that would make a modern dinner guest alternately delighted, bewildered, and reaching for the nearest exit. The Romans understood dining as a social performance, a demonstration of wealth and culture and hospitality, and the dinner party is the primary arena in which this performance is staged. The rules and customs of the Roman scena are numerous, specific, and in several cases entirely alien to modern sensibility. The Roman dining room, the triclinium, is arranged with 3 couches around a central table, each couch accommodating 3 diners who recline rather than sit. Reclining is the correct posture for dining. Sitting upright while eating marks you as either a barbarian or a child. The guests arrange themselves on the couches in a specific order that reflects their social relationship to the host and to each other, with the most honored position being the left couch's middle seat and the least honored being the right couch's right seat. Getting this seating arrangement wrong, placing someone in a position below their social dignity, is a social catastrophe equivalent to seating people incorrectly at a formal modern dinner, except that in Rome the potential consequences include damaged business relationships and the end of political alliances. The food at a formal Roman dinner party is served in multiple courses and can include dishes that a modern guest would find challenging. A first course of eggs, olives, and dormice, the latter being small rodents that are considered a delicacy, typically served roasted and stuffed with pork and pine nuts, is entirely conventional. The main course might include the kind of elaborate preparations that the cookbook attributed to Apicius describes. Fish sauces of considerable complexity, dishes combining ingredients that modern cooking would keep separate, preparations involving the internal organs of animals and combinations that the modern diner typically encounters only in specific cultural contexts. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that is to Roman cooking what soy sauce is to East Asian cooking, features in almost every dish, providing the umami depth that gives Roman food its characteristic flavor and its characteristic smell, which is described by those who have tried to recreate it as somewhere between excellent Worcestershire sauce and something left in the sun. Livius Thermopolium serves the street version of Roman food, not the elaborate dinner party cuisine of the wealthy but the practical daily food of the working city. Her counter has built-in terracotta containers sunk into the stone surface, kept warm by charcoal below, containing the prepared foods of the day: lentil stew, bread, olives, dried figs, hard-boiled eggs, and a wine that is diluted to an appropriate strength for consumption at working hours. Her customers eat standing at the counter or sitting on the steps nearby, and the food is good. Livia is a skilled cook who has been feeding the neighborhood for 12 years, and it is cheap, because her customers are workers and craftspeople for whom the thermopolium is the primary source of cooked meals. Most Romans do not cook at home. The fire risk in the insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that house most of the city's population, is severe enough that cooking fires are discouraged, and the thermopolium is the Roman version of the takeaway restaurant, the fast food outlet, and the neighborhood cafe all in one. The Roman practice of vomiting between courses at a dinner party is one of the most persistent myths about Roman dining, and it deserves careful treatment because the truth is both more interesting and more complicated than the myth. The vomitorium, in Roman architecture, is not a room for vomiting. It is a passageway in a theater or arena through which large numbers of people can exit quickly. The word comes from the Latin vomere, meaning to spew forth, and describes the spewing forth of crowds, not meals. That said, the Roman physician Celsus does discuss induced vomiting as a health practice, and some Roman sources do describe wealthy diners eating to excess and vomiting between courses, but this was considered excess and self-indulgence even by Roman standards, not a normal feature of the dinner party. The myth of universal Roman vomiting is a later invention that tells us more about what subsequent centuries wanted to believe about Roman decadence than about what Romans actually did. What is entirely normal at the Roman dinner party and would cause the modern guest considerable discomfort is the entertainment. Dinner parties at wealthy homes routinely include performances by enslaved musicians, dancers, and acrobats, people who are the property of the host and who perform for the guests' entertainment with no more agency in the matter than the wine in the cups. The guests discuss the performances critically, as one might discuss a piece of music or a stage performance, with no acknowledgement that the performers are persons with inner lives rather than animated objects. This is the aspect of Roman normality that is perhaps the hardest for the modern visitor to navigate, because it is not a quirk or an eccentricity, it is structural, embedded in every aspect of Roman society, and the Romans, who were in every other way thoughtful and humane people, participated in it without moral discomfort. The Roman relationship with death is one of the most striking areas of divergence between Roman normality and modern sensibility, and it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most obvious level, there is the gladiatorial combat, the public killing and near killing of human beings as entertainment, which is so thoroughly documented and so thoroughly discussed that it risks becoming too familiar, too absorbed into the general knowledge of Roman weirdness, to be seen clearly for what it is. So let us try to see it clearly. The gladiatorial games are attended by hundreds of thousands of Roman citizens over the course of a year, at venues ranging from the Colosseum in Rome, capable of holding 50 to 80,000 spectators, to the small amphitheaters in every provincial town of significance. The games include gladiatorial combats, animal hunts, venations, in which exotic animals from across the empire are displayed and killed, and public executions, the damnatio ad bestias, the condemned being killed by animals in the arena, which is both a punishment and a form of entertainment. The audience includes men and women, wealthy and poor, senators and street vendors. They are there to see people and animals die, and they enjoy it, and this enjoyment is not considered sadistic or pathological. It is considered normal civic participation in a traditional Roman institution. Marcus has been to the games perhaps a dozen times. He has a favorite gladiatorial type, the retiarius, the net and trident fighter, whose style of combat he finds more technically interesting than the heavily armored secutor, and he discusses the performances with the same knowledgeable enthusiasm that a modern sports fan brings to the analysis of an athletic performance. He has seen men die in the arena. He has seen the editor, the sponsor of the games, decide the fate of a defeated fighter. He has added his own voice to the crowd's signal. He does not think of himself as cruel. He is not cruel in his dealings with people he knows, with his family, with his business partners. The arena is a specific context with specific rules, and within that context death is part of the entertainment, and this is simply how it is. The Roman funerary customs are their own category of strangeness. When a Roman of any significance dies, the body is displayed in the atrium of the house for several days, wearing the toga and the insignia of whatever offices the deceased had held in life. Professional mourners, hired women who weep and tear their hair and beat their breasts with a professional commitment to grief that has nothing to do with any personal feeling for the deceased, are employed to enhance the emotional atmosphere of the funeral. The funeral procession through the streets of Rome includes actors wearing the wax masks of the deceased's ancestors, dressed in the appropriate historical togas and magistrates' insignia, so that the dead man goes to his burial accompanied by all his forebears, a column of the illustrious dead walking with the merely recently dead. The Roman practice of keeping wax death masks of family ancestors, the imagines, in the atrium of the home, displayed in wooden cabinets, is both a form of ancestor veneration and a practical tool of social signaling. The more ancestral masks you have on display, the longer your family's history of civic distinction, and the more impressive your social credentials. New families, the novae homines, the new men who have risen from lower social origins to positions of importance, are mocked for their lack of ancestral masks. Cicero, who was a new man himself and suffered from this deficit, compensates with particular vehemence in his rhetoric about the irrelevance of birth to genuine merit, which everyone understood as the argument of a man who wished the masks were not counted. Gaius has attended several Roman funerals in the course of his medical training, sometimes as the physician who certifies the death and sometimes simply as a mourner for colleagues of his master. He finds the professional mourners fascinating from a medical perspective. The physiological effects of extended theatrical grief are real, regardless of the absence of genuine emotion, and some of the mourners achieve states of apparent distress that are genuinely difficult to distinguish from the real thing. He has also attended the dissection of a criminal's body, dissection of free persons being illegal in Rome. It is only bodies from the arena or executed criminals that the medical profession can study directly, and found that the experience of seeing the interior of a human body for the first time is not quite what he expected. It is less shocking than the arena. It is more important. The Roman economic world is one where practices that would be considered deeply problematic in the modern context are not only normal but are the foundations of the entire economy. The most fundamental of these is slavery, not as a peripheral institution but as the central organizing fact of the Roman economy. At the height of the empire, scholars estimate that between 20 and 30% of the population of Italy are enslaved, and enslaved labor powers virtually every sector of the economy, from agriculture to mining to domestic service to skilled craft production to education to medicine. The physician who trains Gaius is himself a freedman, a formerly enslaved person who has been freed by his owner, and the practice of using educated enslaved people as teachers, physicians, architects, and accountants is so normal that it is the subject of no more moral commentary than the use of any other economic resource. The Roman financial system includes practices around lending and money management that would make a modern financial regulator reach for their enforcement toolkit. The rate of interest on loans, which Roman law attempts to regulate but which in practice varies widely, can be exorbitant by modern standards, and the consequences of defaulting on a debt are correspondingly severe. Debt bondage, the situation where a debtor who cannot repay their debt becomes effectively owned by their creditor, is abolished in Rome in 326 BCE, but the social and economic pressure it creates persists in various forms throughout the Republican and imperial periods. Crassus, the fabulously wealthy Roman financier of the late Republic, made part of his fortune by running a private fire brigade that would arrive at a burning building and negotiate the price of their services with the owner while the building was actively on fire. Marcus conducts his business according to the norms of the Roman commercial world, which include a number of practices that would be considered unethical in a modern business context. He adulterates his olive oil with cheaper oils, not to the point of making it unusable, but enough to increase his margins. He weights his scales slightly in his favor when selling and slightly in the buyer's favor when buying, as every merchant does and everyone knows everyone does, so that both sides adjust their expectations accordingly. He bribes the customs officials at the port with a small percentage of the value of each shipment, which is not considered corruption. It is considered the expected cost of doing business, the official's supplement to his inadequate salary, the lubricant without which the wheels of commerce do not turn. These are not secrets. They are simply how business is done. The Roman approach to social mobility is both more flexible and more explicitly transactional than modern sensibility is quite comfortable with. Money can buy social position in Rome in ways that are more nakedly acknowledged than in most modern societies. A wealthy freedman, a formerly enslaved person who has accumulated money through commercial activity, can, within a generation, have grandchildren who are indistinguishable from the freeborn middle class. The Emperor Claudius's powerful freedman secretaries, Narcissus, Pallas, Callistus, wielded power that the traditional aristocracy found deeply offensive not because they were corrupt but because they were successful, and their success as formerly enslaved men challenged the ideology of birth-based social precedents that the aristocracy depended on for its claim to authority. Livia is a freed woman who has done well. She was freed 10 years ago by the merchant who owned her. She had managed his household and his accounts for 15 years with a competence that eventually made him feel that freeing her was the correct thing to do, and also that having her as a free client who owed him obligations was more useful than having her as an enslaved person who merely obeyed orders. The distinction matters less in practice than the legal categories suggest, because the freed person's obligations to their former owner, the patron, are extensive and socially enforced. But Livia is good at the obligations. She knows what she owes and she pays it, in the currency of service and loyalty and the useful application of her skills to the patron's interests. And in return she has his protection and his recommendation and the ability to run her thermopolium without the interference that an unprotected woman in business would face. She has made of necessity a very functional arrangement. Roman religion is one of the areas where the gap between Roman normality and modern sensibility is widest, and also one of the most interesting to explore, because the Roman religious world is so thoroughly different from anything that most modern people have direct experience of that it requires a genuine imaginative effort to inhabit it. The Roman religious world is polytheistic in a very specific sense. Not just that there are many gods, but that the gods are present everywhere, that they are engaged with the details of daily life in ways that require constant attention and management, and that the maintenance of correct relations with the divine is a practical civic obligation rather than a personal spiritual choice. Every Roman household has its Lares, the household gods, the spirits of the ancestors who protect the home and the family, and the lararium, the small household shrine, is typically placed in the kitchen or the atrium where it can be tended daily. Every morning Marcus's household performs a small ritual at the lararium, a pinch of incense, a small offering of food, a brief prayer, before the day's business begins. This is not optional, not a personal expression of faith, not something done only by the particularly pious. It is a daily maintenance task like checking the door is bolted or the fire is banked, the kind of thing that failure to do is not a theological statement but a practical oversight. The Roman practice of divination, reading the will of the gods through the examination of various signs and portents, is built into the structure of Roman public life in a way that has no modern equivalent. Before any significant public action, a military campaign, a legal proceeding, the founding of a colony, the election of magistrates, the auspices must be taken. The augurs, the official priests responsible for divination, observe the flight of birds, the feeding behavior of the sacred chickens, the appearance of lightning, and pronounce on whether the gods favor the proposed action. In theory, an unfavorable omen can halt any public activity. In practice, the system is manipulated. The sacred chickens can be encouraged to eat enthusiastically if they have been kept hungry, and an inconvenient thunderstorm can be noticed or not noticed according to the political requirements of the moment. The divine machinery is real and important and also completely controllable by those who know how to operate it, which is a combination that Romans find entirely coherent and modern observers find somewhat confusing. Gaius approaches Roman religion with the same systematic curiosity he brings to medicine. He has been exposed to multiple religious traditions. His Greek family background gives him access to the Greek philosophical tradition's somewhat skeptical relationship with the gods, while his Roman education has instilled the civic religion's emphasis on correct practice over correct belief. He has also, in the course of his medical training, encountered the mystery religions that are spreading through Rome from the east, the cult of Isis, the cult of Mithras, early Christianity, and he finds them interesting from a medical perspective because of the effect they have on their adherents. The sense of community, the shared ritual, the experience of divine presence that the initiates describe, these things have real effects on health and well-being that his medical training allows him to observe even if it does not yet have the framework to explain. The Roman practice of taking the gods of conquered peoples and incorporating them into the Roman pantheon, Interpretatio Romana, is one of the most pragmatic features of Roman religious policy and one that has no real modern equivalent. When Rome encounters a new people with their own gods, the standard approach is to identify which Roman gods those foreign gods correspond to and acknowledge them accordingly. The Germanic god Odin becomes Mercury. The Celtic goddess Epona is incorporated wholesale. The Egyptian Isis is welcomed and given a temple in Rome. The only religions that Rome has real difficulty with are the ones that insist on exclusivity, that their god is the only god and all others are false, which is why Judaism and eventually Christianity create the particular political and religious tensions they do. The Roman religious framework simply does not have a category for a god who will not share space with other gods. Roman education is another area of significant divergence from modern expectations, beginning with the fundamental question of whether a child is educated at all. The decision to raise a newborn child, the practice of accepting or exposing, is made by the father, the paterfamilias, whose legal authority over the lives of his children is absolute and does not expire when they reach adulthood. A father who decides not to raise a child, because of poverty, because the child is a girl when a boy was wanted, because the child appears unhealthy, can expose it, leaving it at the city gate or the rubbish dump or the foot of the columna lactaria in Rome, the column near which exposed children are traditionally left. This is not considered murder. It is considered a decision, one that is made with varying degrees of regret or pragmatism, and the exposed child's fate, death or rescue and adoption into a new family, or rescue and raising as a slave, is not the exposing family's responsibility. The education of Roman children who are raised proceeds by stages that are recognizable in their broad outlines and alien in their specific content. The elementary teacher, the ludi magister, runs a school that meets outdoors or in a rented room, and the curriculum is reading, writing, and basic arithmetic, conducted through repetition and memorization and enforced by corporal punishment that is both routine and unremarkable. The rod is the primary pedagogical tool at the elementary level, and the beating of students for errors is considered not cruelty but the appropriate stimulus to learning. Horace describes his teacher as plagosum, fond of flogging, with an affectionate irony that suggests he is describing a normal experience rather than an exceptional one. The secondary level of Roman education is provided by the grammaticus, who teaches literature and rhetoric, and the pedagogy here is less physically violent but no less demanding. The student memorizes extensive passages of Homer and Virgil. He learns to analyze meter and figure of speech with a technical precision that would challenge a modern literature student. He is expected to be able to compose speeches on set themes, controversiae, that argue both sides of a legal or moral question, building the rhetorical flexibility that the Roman public life will require. The goal of Roman secondary education is not knowledge in the abstract but the specific capability to function in public life, to speak persuasively in the courts, the assembly, the senate. Gaius's education has included time with both a grammaticus and a reader before he enters medical training, which is conducted not in a formal institution. There are no medical schools in the modern sense, but as an apprenticeship to a practicing physician. He has read Hippocrates in Greek and Celsus in Latin, and he has watched more surgical procedures than most people his age have watched anything, and he has concluded that what distinguishes good medicine from bad medicine is the same thing that distinguishes good rhetoric from bad rhetoric. The quality of observation, the willingness to look at what is actually there rather than what the theory says should be there, and the discipline to record what you see accurately enough that it can be communicated to someone who is not present. He is going to be a good physician. He is also going to be a Roman, which means that some of his treatments are going to be gladiatorial blood and some of them are going to be willow bark tea, and he has made his peace with not always knowing which category a given treatment belongs to. The physical experience of a Roman city would overwhelm a modern visitor before they had gone half a block. The noise alone would be extraordinary. The rumble of cart wheels on stone. Wheeled vehicles are banned from the city during daylight hours, so the deliveries happen at night, and the city never entirely sleeps. The voices of the street vendors whose calls have specific traditional forms that Romans learned to decode the way a modern city dweller learns to distinguish the sound of a police siren from an ambulance, the sound of the construction that is almost always happening somewhere in a city, that is perpetually building, the sounds of animals, the pigs kept in urban apartments and the mules of the delivery carts and the oxen of the builders' wagons and the occasional more exotic animal being transported to the arena. The smell of a Roman city is another sensory experience that requires significant recalibration of modern expectations. The sewers, Rome's cloaca maxima being one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, handle liquid waste with remarkable efficiency, but solid waste management in the insulae is less systematic. The contents of chamber pots are supposed to be taken to the public latrines or the designated collection points, but in the upper floors of 6-story apartment buildings at 2 in the morning, the temptation to open the window and simply tip the pot into the street below is evidently irresistible to a significant proportion of the population. Roman law makes this illegal. Roman law's ability to monitor the upper floors of 6-story apartment buildings at 2 in the morning is limited. Marcus walks to the Forum Romanum every morning to conduct his business, a route he has walked so many times that he navigates it partly by memory and partly by the specific sounds and smells that mark each section of the journey. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery on the corner. The smell of the tannery 2 blocks further along that he has complained about to the aedile 3 times without result. The sound of the blacksmith who starts work before dawn. The particular organic smell of the street in the block where the fuller's establishment operates, which Marcus associates now with the beginning of the working day so strongly that he barely notices it. The Rome that Marcus navigates is not the marble city of the monuments, it is the wooden and brick and plaster city of the residential neighborhoods, densely packed and perpetually noisy and smelling of the activities of a million people living close together without the waste management infrastructure that a million people require. The danger of the Roman street is real and multifaceted. The fire risk in Rome is extreme. The insulae are largely wooden, closely packed, and heated by open charcoal braziers, and the city burns regularly enough that the vigiles, the fire brigade, are one of the city's permanent institutions. The Augustus Fire Brigade has 7 cohorts of approximately 1,000 men each, responsible for 14 administrative regions of the city, and they are busy. The collapse risk is also real. The upper stories of the taller insulae are built with an optimism about structural engineering that is not always justified by the quality of the construction. And the collapse of a poorly built insula is not a once-in-a-generation event but something that happens regularly enough that a Roman resident of the upper floors has a reasonable actuarial basis for anxiety. The street crime of Rome, the robbery, the assault, the more organized criminal activity that the ancient sources describe, is difficult to assess with confidence because the sources are not reliable witnesses to their own normality. What is clear is that Rome has no organized police force in the modern sense. The vigilas deal with fire and some street crime. The urban cohorts handle serious public order problems. The day-to-day safety of the street is managed by the combination of the physical presence of people. Rome's streets are crowded enough that significant crime requires some degree of concealment, and the informal social control of neighborhood networks that know everyone's business and are consequently aware when something is wrong. Livia knows her neighborhood the way a modern person knows their contact list, and her network of customers and suppliers and neighbors constitutes a form of social intelligence that makes her thermopolium both safer and better informed than any modern CCTV system. Roman leisure is organized around a set of institutions that have no precise modern equivalents and that reveal a great deal about Roman priorities and values. The most important of these is the thermae, the public bath, which is simultaneously a hygiene facility, a social club, a gymnasium, a library, and a place of business. The great imperial thermae of Rome, Caracalla's, Diocletian's, are vast complexes capable of serving thousands of bathers simultaneously, with hot rooms and cold rooms and warm rooms and swimming pools and exercise yards and gardens and spaces for reading and conversation and the kind of informal business meeting that takes place between men who happen to be in the same hot room without their social armor of toga and client lists. The Roman bathing routine has a specific sequence that is as ritualized as the morning routine in Dorothy's 1950s kitchen. You undress in the apoditorium, leaving your clothes with an attendant. Theft is a problem at the baths, and the slaves who watch your clothes expect a tip for doing so. You move to the tepidarium, the warm room, to acclimatize. Then the caldarium, the hot room where you sweat and are scraped with a strigil, a curved metal implement, to remove the dead skin and dirt that the heat has loosened. Then the frigidarium, the cold plunge, which shocks the system back to alertness. The whole process takes a minimum of an hour, and most Romans take considerably longer, using the social spaces of the bath for the business and conversation that constitute as much of the bathing visit as the actual bathing. Marcus goes to the baths every afternoon. This is not unusual. Most Romans of the middle class who can afford the time go to the baths daily, and the entrance fee is nominal enough that the baths are accessible to most of the city's population. He uses the time for business as much as for relaxation, conducting the conversations that are easier to have when both parties are naked and relaxed than when they are in the formal dress of the forum. He has closed deals in the tepidarium that he could not have closed in the forum. He has gathered information in the caldarium that no amount of formal inquiry would have produced. The baths are, for Marcus, what the coffee klatch is for Dorothy, the social space where the informal business of daily life gets done. The chariot races at the Circus Maximus are the Romans' preferred mass entertainment, even more popular than the gladiatorial games. The Circus Maximus holds perhaps 250,000 spectators, the largest sports venue in the history of the world, and on race days the crowd is drawn from every social level, men and women sitting together in the stands, the normal social segregation of Roman life suspended in the democracy of collective excitement. The 4 chariot racing factions, the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites, command passionate loyalty from their fans, loyalty that in Constantinople under the later empire will eventually fuel actual political violence. In Rome they fuel vigorous argument, extensive betting, and the kind of passionate partisanship that makes complete strangers immediate friends or enemies depending on their team affiliations. The Roman theater is another form of mass entertainment that would disorient a modern visitor, not because of its violence but because of its raucousness. Roman theater audiences are not the respectful silent witnesses of the modern theatrical experience. They talk. They eat. They jeer at performances they dislike and cheer at the ones they favor. They bring animals. They arrive in the middle of performances and leave before the end. The performers have to compete with the audience's inattention, which produces a performance style that is correspondingly broad and emphatic. The exaggerated masks and movements of Roman comedy, which translate even across the noise of a crowd that is only partially attending. Livia goes to the theater occasionally and finds it a reasonable way to spend an afternoon, even though the plays are predictable and the comedy relies on the same stock characters and misunderstandings that it has always relied on, because the real entertainment is the crowd as much as the stage. The Roman family is organized around the legal concept of the patria potestas, the father's power, which gives the paterfamilias, the oldest living male in the family line, legal authority over the persons and property of everyone in his household, including his adult children and their children. In theory, this authority extends to the power of life and death over family members, though the exercise of this power is increasingly constrained by law and social custom through the imperial period. In practice, the paterfamilias's authority is exercised primarily through control of property and the management of marriages, which is sufficient power to shape the lives of everyone in his household with considerable completeness. Roman marriage is a legal and economic arrangement rather than a romantic one, and the practices around it reflect this honestly. Girls of the upper class are typically married in their early to mid-teens, to men who are often considerably older. The girl's consent is technically required but in practice rarely constituted an effective veto. A daughter who refused a match her father had arranged was exercising a right that the law gave her but that social convention made it very difficult to use. The dowry, the property that the bride's family provides at marriage, is an essential component of the arrangement and is negotiated with the same careful attention to detail as any other financial transaction, because it is exactly that. The legal position of Roman women is complicated by the tension between the formal structures of Roman law, which place women under the guardianship of a male tutor for significant legal transactions, and the practical reality of Roman social life, which includes many women who exercise real economic and social power. The wealthy widow, freed by her husband's death from the constraints of marriage and, in the later empire, increasingly freed from the requirement of a male tutor for legal purposes, is one of the most economically active figures in the Roman world. She owns property, runs businesses, manages investments, and participates in the patronage network that is the structural foundation of Roman social life, all without any requirement to be subordinate to a man in the practical conduct of her affairs. Livia's legal status as a freed woman is in some ways more constrained and in some ways more free than the legal status of a freeborn woman of the same economic level. She owes obligations to her former owner that a freeborn woman does not owe. She faces social prejudice from the freeborn that a freeborn woman does not face. But she also has a practical independence in the management of her business that comes from the specific combination of her legal status, her patron's protection, and her own competence, and she has arranged these elements into an economic life that is, by the standards of any class in any era, reasonably successful. She does not think of herself as constrained. She thinks of herself as having made the best available arrangement with the world as it is, which is the same thing that most people think when they have, in fact, made the best available arrangement with the world as it is. The Roman attitude toward sexuality is another area of significant divergence from modern norms, and it is one that requires care to describe accurately because it is so frequently misrepresented in both directions, either sanitized to the point of invisibility or sensationalized to the point of caricature. The Roman sexual world is organized not primarily around the modern categories of heterosexual and homosexual. These categories are not the fundamental organizing principles of Roman sexuality, but around the categories of active and passive, dominant and subordinate, and crucially around the distinction between citizens and non-citizens, free and enslaved. What is considered morally acceptable is determined less by the gender of the participants and more by their social status and by who is in the active and who is in the passive role. A male Roman citizen who takes the active role with a male enslaved person is behaving within the norms. The same male citizen taking the passive role with anyone is violating a norm that Roman culture enforces with considerable social pressure. The Roman army is the institution that makes everything else about the Roman world possible, and it is organized with a systematic intelligence that is one of the most impressive achievements of the ancient world. But it is also an institution whose internal culture includes practices that would make a modern military lawyer reach for their files before the parade ground inspection was over. Let us consider what it means to be a Roman legionary in the 1st century CE. The Roman legionary signs up for a 25-year term of service. This is not a misprint. 25 years, during which he will typically not be allowed to legally marry. The ban on legionary marriage is not lifted until the reign of Septimius Severus in 197 CE, will march on average perhaps 3,000 miles per year on campaign, will sleep in a tent that he shares with 7 other men and carries himself on the march, and will subsist primarily on a diet of grain, supplemented by whatever the foragers can find and whatever the markets near the camp provide. He will be paid, and his pay is not trivial. The Roman legionary is a professional soldier, not a conscript, and his salary reflects this. But a significant portion of his pay is deducted at source for food, equipment, and the burial club that will ensure he has a proper funeral if he dies on campaign, which, given the statistical realities of 25 years of military service, is not an abstract possibility. The disciplinary system of the Roman army is both its greatest strength and one of its most disturbing features. The Roman word decimation, one of the most vivid contributions of the Roman military vocabulary to modern language, refers to the practice of punishing a unit guilty of cowardice or mutiny by selecting 1 soldier in 10 by lot and having the other 9 kill him. The 9 men who kill their comrade are then required to camp outside the main camp and eat barley rather than wheat for a period. The practice was rare even in the Roman period. It was too destructive of unit cohesion to be used frequently, but its existence as a theoretical possibility, as a sanction available to commanders, tells us something important about the Roman military's understanding of the relationship between individual soldiers and the collective unit. The Roman army builds as much as it fights, and the building is in many ways more consequential than the fighting. Every Roman marching camp is a constructed fortification, built to a standard design in a matter of hours by the soldiers who will sleep in it that night. The road network that spans the empire is largely the work of the army, built by legionaries who are not fighting, under military discipline and with military precision. The aqueducts, the bridges, the frontier fortifications. All of these are military construction projects staffed by the same men who would fight if fighting were required but who spend most of their service digging, surveying, and building. The Roman army is, among other things, the largest construction company in the history of the ancient world, and the infrastructure it builds will serve the populations of its conquered territories for centuries after the Roman political authority has disappeared. Gaius's medical practice takes him occasionally to the military hospitals near Rome, the valetudinaria that serve the legionary garrisons, and he is struck by the level of medical organization that the military has developed. The systematic wound cleaning, the recognition that certain wounds become infected and certain treatments prevent infection, the dietary management of the recovery period, the separation of patients with infectious conditions. None of this is theoretically articulated in the terms that modern medicine would use, but all of it is practiced, with the pragmatic empiricism that distinguishes good military medicine from its theoretical counterpart. The Roman army has learned what works by treating the casualties of many campaigns, and what it has learned is not nothing. The Roman Empire at its height is, by many measures, one of the most impressive administrative and cultural achievements in human history. It provides internal peace, the Pax Romana, to a territory of perhaps 5 million square kilometers and 50 to 60 million people for approximately 2 centuries. It builds infrastructure whose engineering quality will not be matched until the 19th century. It develops a legal system whose principles are still operative in the legal traditions of most of the modern world. It transmits the Greek intellectual tradition, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, literature, to medieval Europe, preserving it through the collapse of the Western Empire and the recovery of the Eastern one. And it does all of this on the foundation of enslaved labor, of military conquest and political violence, of an economic system that extracts wealth from its periphery to concentrate it in its center, of a social order that places the lives of the many in the legal control of the few. The roads are beautiful, and they were built by enslaved and conscripted workers who had no choice in the matter. The aqueducts bring clean water to the cities, and they were constructed at enormous human cost in the quarries and on the construction sites. The legal system is sophisticated, and it excludes the majority of the people who live under it from its most important protections. The Pax Romana is peaceful for those who do not resist it and considerably less peaceful for those who do. Marcus, Livia, and Gaius all live in the same city and in the same empire and in entirely different Romes. Marcus's Rome is the Rome of business and civic life and the baths and the games, a world of reasonable comfort and reasonable anxiety, of social competition and social pleasure, of a city that provides more of what a person needs than almost any other city in the world at this time. Livia's Rome is the Rome of the formerly enslaved, of the freed woman who has built something from the limited materials available to her, of the city that is simultaneously an opportunity and an obstacle depending on where you stand within it. Gaius's Rome is the Rome of learning and observation, of a civilization that has accumulated more knowledge of the human body and the natural world than any previous civilization, and that is just beginning to develop the methods by which it can be systematically extended. The perfectly normal things of Rome that feel totally wrong to us are not evidence of Roman stupidity or Roman cruelty, though some of them are evidence of both. They are evidence of the specific conditions under which a specific civilization developed its specific answers to the universal human questions of how to live and die and eat and govern and build and worship and love and fight. Some of those answers were better than what came before them and worse than what came after. Some of them were so good that we still use them. Some of them were so bad that we still define ourselves by our rejection of them. All of them were, to the people who lived with them, simply how things were, the normal against which nothing else was yet measured, the world into which they had been born and within which they built their lives with the materials available to them. This is what all of us do. The Romans did it on a larger stage than most, and left more of it visible for the centuries to examine. For that, at least, we can be grateful. It is evening in Rome. Marcus has returned from the baths, and he is sitting in the atrium of his apartment. Not a grand atrium, but a respectable one, with a small impluvium to catch rainwater and the lararium in its corner, dictating a letter to his freedman's secretary. The letter is about a shipment of oil from Campania that has arrived short of the agreed weight, and Marcus is composing the complaint with the particular care that a letter that may end up in a legal dispute requires. The evening light is coming through the opening in the roof above the impluvium, catching the dust motes in the air and the bronze of the household gods on the lararium shelf. He will finish the letter, eat a simple dinner, bread, olives, cheese, a cup of wine, and be asleep before full dark. He has been awake since before dawn, and tomorrow will be the same. Livia is closing her thermopolium for the night, banking the coals under the food containers, covering the remaining food, sweeping the stone floor of the counter area. She does this every evening alone. Her two assistants have gone home, and she likes the quiet of it, the end-of-day ritual that marks the transition from the public performance of running the business to the private reality of being herself. She counts the day's takings. It has been a good day, slightly above the average, and locks them in the box under her bed. She eats some of the leftover lentil stew from the container that has been sitting warm all day and finds it, as she always does, better than it has any right to be after 10 hours of gentle heat. She will be up before dawn. She will do this again tomorrow. Gaius is writing up his case notes by lamplight in the room he rents above a bookshop in the Subura. He writes in Greek, which is the language of medicine and the language he thinks in when he thinks about bodies and disease, and the notes are detailed and precise and occasionally wrong in ways that he does not yet know are wrong and that it will take several more centuries of medical practice to correct. He is 23 years old, and he is going to be a good physician and a careful observer and a man who contributes something small but real to the accumulation of knowledge that will eventually, after a very long time, by a very indirect route, become modern medicine. He does not know this. He knows only that the lamp is burning low and the case notes are almost done, and tomorrow there are 2 more patients to see, and the physician he trains under wants his opinion on a patient with a condition neither of them has encountered before. He is looking forward to it. This is what he was made for. This has been Midnight Chronicle. Sleep well wherever in the world you are tonight.